Welcome to CNI Jerusalem Calling, your source for unfiltered Mideast talk radio. I'm your host today, Alison Weir, CNI board member and director of If Americans Knew. This show is a project of the CNI Foundation, which works for fair U.S. policies in the Middle East and fair discussion of those policies here in America. Find out more about us at our website, www.cnionline.org. Our guest on the show today is Dr. Sama Adnan, Executive Director of New Policy, an organization of American citizens committed to enhancing American security through establishing a just resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I'm so happy to have you with us today, Dr. Adnan.
Hello, how are you? Thank you.
It's great to have you. Can you tell us about yourself and what attracted you to this conflict and a little bit about your personal background?
Sure, yes. I'm an Arab American. My parents moved here when I was 10 years old from Sudan. I went to Rice University. I'm actually a scientist by training. I graduated with a degree in biochemistry and then later did my PhD at UCLA. Graduated with a PhD in immunology, infectious diseases. But throughout this time, it was very, very interesting to me how American foreign policy is more dictated by domestic issues rather than what's good for the United States and what America's national interests are in the Middle East. Over the years, it became apparent that a very powerful pro-Israel lobby in Washington, D.C. is essentially setting up America's foreign policy in the Middle East through domestic politics. So I've been actually active in speaking out about why there isn't another lobby on the other side promoting America's national interest and promoting better policies in the Middle East that better suit our own interests and our own values so that we no longer are compromised throughout the world as a country that doesn't respect international law and what the world perceives as justice for both Israelis and Palestinians that is not being met.
That's the view that I and many people, when we learn about this issue, have been holding. We feel that these policies, in so many cases, do not represent what most of us feel are American principles, and they certainly are very counter to U.S. interests and very damaging to the United States as well. I'm honored to be on the board of directors of your new organization, newpolicy.organization, so I just wanted to let everybody know that situation. It would be great to have you tell us a little bit more about New Policy Organization.
It's kind of like a family of organizations, and it has two main organizations, newpolicy.org and New Policy PAC. Newpolicy.org is an advocacy group. It's basically a way for Americans to have a voice in Washington, D.C. Newpolicy.org would go to Congress on Capitol Hill and advocate for the rights of both Palestinians and Israelis and call for an end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and for an end to the Israeli occupation, while pointing out that important government figures have recently spoken out against the occupation and against settlements, noting that they are detrimental to America's national interest. So newpolicy.org is an advocacy group. While at the same time it's great to go and talk to Congress, it's pretty much superfluous to do so without a political action committee that funds the congressional campaigns of representatives of the House and senators, because no matter how much they agree with our premise, no matter how much they agree with our policies, no matter how much they agree with the fact that our current policies are detrimental to American interests, they cannot do much about it without getting campaign financing. This is actually the simple truth that nobody talks about much in American politics. If you do not lobby the government and fund campaigns of congressmen and senators, then even if they agree with you, they may not support you because they do not want to lose the next election. And even if they do agree with you and they do support you, they might lose the next elections because they are underfunded. So we basically want to act as a counterweight to hardline pro-Israel PACs that support many congressmen, even if the congressmen actually agree with our views.
There are several books that have revealed that. The Walton Mearsheimer book that came out a year or two ago now, The Israel Lobby, tells about that to quite a detailed degree. And, of course, before that, Paul Finley's excellent book, They Dare to Speak Out, discussed this situation many years ago. You know, everybody knows about it there inside the Beltway and talks about it. But publicly, Very few have done that, and nationally, there's a great effort to disguise that fact. It's so important to get that out to the American public that this is really what's going on with our policy formation in Washington, D.C. Very few groups have done this, whereas we know the pro-Israel lobby has often dozens of political action committees that are raising money for pro-Israel candidates or for candidates with the understanding that they will be pro-Israel or certainly will not oppose what the Israel lobby wants from them. Can you discuss about how many of those pro-Israel PACs there are that exist and how you feel that one PAC can be significant given the overall power dynamics in Washington, D.C.?
Well, this is actually a very important question because a lot of times, just because of the odds that are against you, many people have put up their hands and said, well, this is not possible, or at least this is futile. I mean, how do you oppose such a huge power structure that has been around for the better part of the last 50 years, I would say? And the answer is actually pretty interesting. There's one organization called AIPAC. It's the major pro-Israel lobby that we're very aware of. Many people, especially in Washington, D.C., their power is very pervasive. They are pretty much everywhere on Capitol Hill, and everybody knows not to cross them. And they have many affiliated PACs with them. And those PACs can be about 100 or even more. It's very hard to know which one of these PACs are actually affiliated with AIPAC or not because they all have names that are quite run-of-the-mill, like Golden Gate Community for Better Citizenship Rights or whatever. I mean, just things that have nothing that would tell you that they are affiliated with Israel or Palestine or any other American foreign policy. But the interesting thing is that they have a lot of leverage as different PACs, but they don't necessarily raise a lot of money as single PACs. Mm-hmm. So what we could do to counter their push is basically to raise a lot of money as a single PAC. There is no reason why, as a single PAC, we couldn't basically do what a lot of small little PACs are doing all over the country. Because while AIPAC is trying to hide what they're doing, because for them, this is something that could be subversive or viewed as, changing American foreign policy from within for the benefit of a foreign nation. For us, this is something that is actually quite important for American citizens to do and indeed patriotic. We are taking back American foreign policy in the Middle East, and there's no reason to disperse all these PACs across the country.
Welcome back. I'm Alison Weir, your host today, Director of If Americans Knew, and on the board of the Council for the National Interest. I'm so happy to have with us today our guest, Dr. Sama Adnan, Executive Director of New Policy, an organization of American citizens committed to enhancing American security through establishing a just resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Dr. Adnan, I wanted to discuss another aspect that I think New Policy PAC and political action committees on this issue can do. I've been interested to see that there have been some very good candidates in different parts of the United States running for Congress on platforms that are specifically discussing Israel-Palestine and that are using their position as candidates for a major political office to also inform their constituents and their communities about the facts on Israel-Palestine. One of these, for example, was Rod Driver, who ran for Congress in Rhode Island several years ago and is in the Rhode Island State Assembly itself. Another man that's about to run once again for U.S. Congress is named Jim Russell. He's from New York, from the district that Nita Lowey is the congresswoman from, who always seems to represent Israeli interests above U.S. interests. I would assume that one of the things that New Policy could do by raising money for candidates such as that would give them the finances necessary to run television advertisements, for example, and print advertisements that could inform those congressional districts about Israel-Palestine. Is that something you could discuss and tell us how that could work?
Absolutely. The reason that money is so important in campaigning is you get to have a platform to explain your stance, to explain your vision. Really, essentially, a candidate needs $20,000 to $30,000 from each PAC to be able to run a good campaign and essentially win. Usually AIPAC, according to the Washington Report on Middle Eastern Affairs, only gives about $2,000 to $3,000 per congressman. But then if you oppose them, they give your opponent running against you in the next election $70,000. what you have to do is be able to fund these congressmen and congresswomen so they have a chance to speak out their conscience. In many of these cases, many of these people already exist. They already are doing things where they're putting their necks on the line. The most recent example is 54 congressmen signed a letter to President Barack Obama asking him to end the Gaza siege. Of course, as you know, there are 1.5 million Palestinians besieged, starved, living in Gaza, and not allowed to have basic resources to even rebuild a year and 3 months after the Gaza invasion, the beginning of 2009. All of these congressmen, many of whom already are in Congress, and many of whom are going to be running as first-time candidates, need support to be able to speak out on this issue. And the only way they can get this support is if we help them by raising money from individuals who understand that peace in the Middle East is in America's national interest.
There's a new lobby that is portraying itself as the sort of counter to AIPAC. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. J Street has gotten quite a bit of attention. Some people, when I speak around the country, I find a lot of people who know quite a bit about Palestine and are very concerned about it, seem to think that J Street is something to support, that this is really a true counter lobby and find this an exciting prospect. How does your organization differ from J Street, and can you discuss what J Street is proposing and what its stance is on issues compared to what New Policy is proposing and discussing?
I'll start off by saying that J Street is a natural ally to newpolicy.org and New Policy PAC. J Street is a liberal, pro-Israel organization, meaning that they're not hardline like AIPAC. They have a more progressive stance. They do stand for many policies that are pro-peace, but they are still pro-Israel. So their difference is really here. Even though a lot of our mission statement is very similar, we call for the end of the Gaza siege, a freeze to Jewish settlements in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and we call for an end to the occupation. They call specifically for a two-state solution, while we just call for a just resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We do not specify what the two sides should actually end up with. We just think that there should be a negotiated settlement between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and we have a very similar mission statement. The difference is that we speak from an American national interest perspective. We do not represent any constituency in the United States or any one specific constituency except for the broad pro-peace constituency. New Policy PAC has made a very large effort to contact many different people across the United States from broad, different ethnic and religious groups, including Arab Americans, Muslim Americans, Protestant Americans, Jewish Americans, Catholic Americans, Latinos and African Americans, everybody that who cares about America's national interest and America's national interest in the Middle East is part of this organization as newpolicy.org and New Policy PAC. J Street, while they have more liberal stances, I think in some ways have still not moved far enough to the center. They are still pro-Israel. It's still difficult for J Street to unequivocally criticize Israel. They came out and actually asked congressmen to vote against the Goldstone report, which I think is shocking, especially because the Goldstone report was written by a very well-respected South African judge whose own daughter is Israeli, and he was commissioned by the United Nations. There are these things that make J Street, while a good organization, in my view, has not gone far enough to the center to induce the United States to become an even-handed mediator in this conflict.
I agree with you. I think it was, to many people, at least those of us who learned this fact, it was fairly astounding, disturbing, and revealing that J Street actually opposed the Goldstone report. That was such a powerful 600 pages of documentation of what had gone on during the Gaza attack that took place about a year ago in 22 days of onslaught against 1.5 million men, women, and children in Gaza, written by a man who is an avowed pro-Israel supporter, who is Jewish himself, who just created a very factual record of what had gone on during that period. Although, as we know, the framing was a little bit inaccurate. The Goldstone report does not really acknowledge that it was Israel that had even violated the ceasefire. Despite that flaw, it's a very powerful and informative and important development, and fairly surprising and, as I say, revealing that J Street actually opposed Goldstone. Also, from what you're telling me and my own view, I think it's very valuable that new policy is really nonpartisan, that it's focusing on Israel-Palestine, on American interests, and can support someone like Jim Russell. I believe he's a Republican, a traditional conservative, which, as many of us know, is very different than the neoconservatives, which have a very different stance.
The long line of James Baker and Bush the First, these are all what we call paleoconservatives who have very different views on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict than George Bush Jr.
Welcome back to CNI Jerusalem Calling. I'm your host, Alison Weir, and with me our guest is Dr. Sama Adnan, Executive Director of New Policy, a new organization working on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, but really trying to represent American interests rather than Israeli interests, which most of the PACs on this issue are doing. Sama, it would be great to have you discuss the political situation in Washington, D.C. these days. As you noted earlier, it's really domestic policies, sadly, that to a large degree write and decree our foreign policies, which is a little bit bizarre. And just recently there has been a report in the UK Guardian, for example. Less often do we get this kind of information in U.S. media, that AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, is specifically mobilizing against President Obama because he is supposedly pro-Palestinian or insufficiently pro-Israel in his policies these days. So can you discuss what AIPAC is doing to try to mobilize against Obama in what really are fairly weak attempts to counter Israeli policies and to represent American policies?
It's actually very telling that when an American president speaks out about a long-standing American foreign policy initiative like ending Jewish settlements in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, which has been America's policy by every single administration for the last 40 years. We have a lobby like AIPAC outwardly countering the president and pushing back at the president of the United States, who himself is supported by General Petraeus, who is the head of command in CENTCOM in the Middle East, who says that Israeli expansionist policies are detrimentally affecting our interests in the Middle East and are hurting our troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. So we have this new dynamic here today where President Obama is trying to maintain America's policy vis-a-vis Israel-Palestine, which is a peace resolution based on the 1967 borders. And even that AIPAC is not sufficiently pro-Israel, which basically means AIPAC wants President Obama to never criticize Israel and to never push Israel to work for the cause of peace. Even more interesting is that while President Netanyahu or Prime Minister Netanyahu was visiting the United States to visit President Obama, he stopped at AIPAC, at the AIPAC conference, which I'm sure you guys have heard of, where he stood and spoke to the AIPAC audience. I think there were about 7,000 people at the conference, which gives you an idea of how much work we have to do. And he basically said that Jerusalem is not a settlement, which of course is ridiculous because nobody was implying that Jerusalem is a settlement. But when you push Jewish citizens from West Jerusalem or Israel proper and push them into East Jerusalem, into Jewish-only enclaves where they drive through Jewish-only streets, this is the kind of apartheid that Jimmy Carter referred to back in 2005, I think, when his book came out, Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid, and he was attacked by all sides in the United States and the U.S. media for saying something that has been said for years in the Israeli media.
It's interesting that Carter came under such attack for really a factual book. If anything, truthfully, his history is quite a bit skewed toward the Israeli narrative rather than the actual factual history. But in terms of discussing the situation today, it was a very informative, valuable book, and he was attacked for it. The interesting thing is, despite this media attack and onslaught from various organizations claiming to represent all Jewish Americans, which they don't, Jimmy Carter's approval rating is extremely high. It's the highest of any former president in the United States. So I think it's important to note how respected this man is. And even following his very factual discussion of Israel-Palestine, his approval rating has remained quite high. So I think the attacks don't really represent the majority of Americans. We have Dave from New Jersey who's called in. Dave, what can you ask us today?
My point is why we are not going after the U.S. Congress and the government with their pro-Israel policies. Today, the median income in Israel is $37,000, which is higher than most of the U.S. states, and just below Hong Kong and Singapore. If you look at NASDAQ, Israelis have more companies listed than India or China. And our Congress, if you look at January resolution, House resolution, there were 390 yes and only 5 no's that Israel has the right to defend itself. Why we are not taking these people to court? Are they representing Israel or they are representing America?
Especially what is so valuable about what you've noted is really the financial situation today, in which we have Israel that's rated in the top 30 wealthiest countries on the planet. In fact, sometimes it's rated as 17th highest in terms of the wealth of its economy and its population, receiving more tax money than any other country on earth, more than all of the starving countries of Africa put together, and receiving this massive amount of U.S. tax money, even at a time when the U.S. economy is really in dire shape. Many Americans are losing homes. They're being downsized out of jobs. American veterans are often underserved. VA hospitals around the country are often poorly financed, and they're not giving our returned veterans the kind of care that I feel they've earned and deserve, and yet massive amounts of money are going to Israel.
Perversely, in spite of all of that, Israel is actually conducting policies that damage us in the Middle East and around the world. This is really the flashpoint here. There's nothing wrong with supporting another country if that country somehow benefits us in the long term. But to support a country with billions of dollars a year, more than we give to any other nation, more money that we give per capita than to any other group in the world, and at the same time have our foreign policy needs, our own interests completely ignored by that nation, is what really we have to wake up to as American citizens. True, this money can be used in the United States for a variety of purposes that would, in my view, be more effective, more beneficial to the United States, obviously. But even worse than that is not only are we throwing away billions of dollars a year, we are throwing away billions of dollars a year to hurt our own interests and our own troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. And this, which we have known and has been said by many people before, has not been articulated by an American administration as clearly as it has been by General Petraeus on the field.
As you say, the irony of sending money abroad that we really cannot spare to do things that most Americans would just be horrified to witness, as I have done, and that are also extremely damaging to the United States. It's just truly ironic, and I think people would be shocked and are shocked when they actually learn all the facts on that. One aspect that's often not brought out, the Israel lobby is not just like any other domestic lobby. The organizations in Washington, D.C. that are charged with coming up with our best policies has consistently tried to require the Israel lobby to register as a foreign agent, as U.S. law requires. Grant Smith, an excellent analyst, has written about this quite a bit. Time after time, the Justice Department has tried to go after violations by the Israel lobby of U.S. law, specifically that in many cases they should be required to register as a foreign agent, just as lobbies for Ireland or Italy or any other nation around the world can lobby here, but they just have to acknowledge that they're lobbying on behalf of a foreign country. And yet, because of this, the power and pervasion of the Israel lobby, that requirement consistently is eluded by AIPAC and these other organizations. Welcome back. This is your host today, Alison Weir, and with me is our guest, Dr. Sama Adnan, Executive Director of New Policy. Right now, we'll take a call from New York. Carl, what's your question for Dr. Sama Adnan?
Good afternoon. I have a statement to make to the doctor and also a question. My statement is, in light of the fact that neither branch of government have the guts to try to diminish the $3 billion that we give Israel, one would think that the Israelis themselves would feel like parasites. I know if I was an Israeli, I'd feel like a parasite, taken from a country that owes their life out, running huge deficits, and feathering my own nest. I would be the one. If I was an Israeli, I'd be yelling the word basta. And my question is, years ago, I read an article where every woman who gives birth, every family, the Israeli government gives them a subsidy. Even if a millionaire has 10 kids, he gets 10 checks for the 10 children. Now, we in America, there are many women and families who don't have kids or postpone childbirth because they can't afford to have them. And here we are giving Israel $3 billion a year, and they're supporting childbirth with the form of monies given out to each family. One guy had about 80 kids with 20 different women. We're going for 80 different checks.
Thank you for your call. Dr. Sama, would you like to address the fact that there are additional subsidies of all sorts that go to Israel?
The $3 billion a year is really just the cherry on the cake, if you will. I mean, to me, it's actually the least amount of what we do for Israel. We also provide Israel with endless amounts of weapon supplies, with loan guarantees that Israel has never paid. And this comes out to billions and billions, much more than $3 billion a year. It comes out to about $20 billion a year. This is basically the Apache helicopters, the F-16s that Israel uses to fight civilian populations in Gaza and the West Bank. And moreover, we also have spent $1 trillion this decade alone fighting Iraq because the pro-Israel lobby and Israel thought that was a good idea. And this was well documented by Stephen Walt and John Mersheimer in their book, The Pro-Israel Lobby. This is another way that the United States spends money to protect Israel, even though Israel is not doing anything to bring peace to itself and to the region as a whole. And furthermore, we pay a dear price by destroying America's image and American values as the world sees them. The world perceives us as heartless and cruel because we have supported apartheid on the Mediterranean. We have let ourselves follow a country that is okay with having Jewish-only roads, Jewish-only settlements, and the like. And this has harmed us financially and, of course, in terms of our values and strategic interests.
In terms of the connection to Iraq, as you say, Walt and Mearsheimer really do quite a good job of showing that. Another book that's very valuable that people could read if they need more details is by Stephen Snagoski called The Transparent Cabal that gives a lot of that information. The problem, of course, is often U.S. media don't cover these types of things. Even today, If Americans Knew is having trouble with censorship by an NPR affiliate in Ann Arbor, Michigan radio. So consistently, the media aren't giving the kind of information that this radio show is. But let me take a call from Washington. Idris is on the line. Please, Idris, could you give us your question?
Good afternoon. I had an idea that was proposed to me in a conversation by a friend the other day, and I wanted to know what Dr. Adnan might think of it. What he mentioned to me was he thought that I think it's roughly $3 billion in U.S. military aid to Israel should be split between the government of Israel and the Palestinian Authority and used to be appropriated strictly for purposes that would advance the peace process. So I was just curious as to what Dr. Adnan might think.
I think this is a fair and good idea, but it has to come back to the American citizens. If we want to spend $3 billion a year to give to Israelis and Palestinians to promote the peace process, because that helps us and is beneficial to our interests, and that's great. I don't really think that Israelis or Palestinians need money from us. All they need from us is not to support Israel so that Israel carries out its policies in the Middle East. We don't need to give money to anybody, I don't think.
I concur quite a bit with that, but it's an interesting suggestion. Brian from Canada, please give us your question. In the few minutes we have left, we'll do our best to answer it.
All right, I'll be real quick. I'll make a statement first. I think the doctor there, he addressed it. It's not $3 billion a year that Israel gets. Former Congressman Jim Traffickin said it's between, if you count everything they get from military to everything they get, that's actually between $20 to $30 billion a year. The question is, I'm going to ask you, ma'am, and the good doctor, have you ever heard of the Lavon affair? Have you heard of that, ma'am?
Yes, I have. The Lavon affair is very valuable for Americans to know about.
What about the USS Liberty, ma'am?
The USS Liberty, I've written about quite a bit. If you go to our website, If Americans Knew, and look at U.S. interests, where we discuss the types of things that we've been talking about on the show today, we have a very long section about the Israeli attack on the USS Liberty that killed 34 Americans, injured over 170, and that was covered up by order of the White House and by the Secretary of Defense.
My final question is, ma'am, have you heard of a Dr. Alan Sabrowski?
Yes, I have, Dr. Sabrowski.
Have you been listening to any of his interviews that he's been doing lately?
I have seen his articles. We've posted several of them. We have a website called Israel-Palestine, The Missing Headlines, where we try to give the information from the region that is not being reported, and also some of the excellent analyses and discussions that are being written in this country that similarly we're not seeing in the Washington Post, it's not on CNN or Fox News, and it's not covered by NPR either. Thank you for bringing up those authors and those discussions. Dr. Adnan, I think we have 30 seconds for a wrap-up here.
All right. Well, I would just like to say thank you very much for having me on CNI Jerusalem Calling. And I would like all the listeners to go to our website at newpolicy.org. Spread the word. We need to raise money for congressmen who support the cause of peace and who support America's national interest. There's no time like the present. 2010 elections are right around the corner. Let's raise this money and change American foreign policy.
Thank you for being with us. This is CNI Jerusalem Calling, and Alison Weir. Goodbye. CNI Jerusalem Calling, and Alison Weir. Goodbye. CNI Jerusalem Calling.